Hi guys, we're back here with chapter 11. A lot of good stuff in this chapter. It's just talking about global supply chain and the risk that's associated with operating a global supply chain. And so it wants to start with the idea of what does it mean to go global and how do you go about doing that. It's really just the idea that you're sourcing, manufacturing, transporting, and distributing products outside your native country. So, again, the complexity is greater, and then the use of partners is probably a little bit more. So the book at the bottom of 173 is talking about using third parties to help them accomplish. So I'm trying to get that glare to be less on the screen, but it's not really happening, so sorry about that. Anyway, so I apologize for that if you can't read those images on the screen. What is fueling the interest in globalization in general, and then how is that impacting global supply chains? So I wish we were in class, because this would be a great discussion to think through out loud as a group. What are changes that are going on that are facilitating our ability to conduct business in an international fashion? And so I'd like you to think about that a second. What is changing? What's available? Why is it happening? Again, I may have mentioned to you when I was in my MBA program, decades ago, there's a lot of talk about the economy becoming a global economy, and yet when I graduated from graduate school, I didn't really see that happening that much. Well, it's sure happening now. I mean, everybody is a lot more willing to conduct business internationally, and so I'd like us to think through why that is, and that's the first step of the chapter, page 174. So what are the factors that are influencing this international commerce? One of them is the improvements in transportation. As people began to look at supply chain as a way to serve their customer better, as a way to reclaim some of the profits by running a more efficient supply chain, more focus and effort got to be placed on transportation methodologies, and in particular, what has helped international transportation is the use of containers. Again, think about pre-container days where product would be loaded onto a ship, off the ship into a warehouse, and then handled again off the warehouse into either a rail car or a truck. Well, now the containers themselves can be moved directly onto a trailer from a ship, and so you can see the efficiencies that are happening there. Not just that, but the continual building of infrastructure. So some of these international markets that we're going to have better roads and more transportation infrastructure than they've had before, ports, those sorts of things. So it's just getting easier to connect through the transportation systems that are out there. Freedom of trade, again, kind of a hot topic that could be discussed now with President Trump's protectionist approach and being pretty aggressive with some of the people that we're exporting and importing from. But in general, countries are trying to find ways to trade with one another more efficiently, easier. And so that freedom of trade is making, from a political standpoint, a little bit easier to do international business. The next one is the improvements of communication. Like, can you imagine, say, 20 years ago, and you're wanting to end up doing business with somebody in India, and you've never been to India, or take China, for instance. You've never been to China. You want to do business with these folks. You don't speak Chinese, but yet they seem like they could be a better supplier than you have already. But man, I'd have to fly over there every time to try to have these meetings, and how difficult that would be, and we can't get our systems to sync up. And well, obviously, with the internet, and things like digital and FaceTime and those sorts of things, we can have those communications easier, more efficiently, less costly, and begin to strengthen those relationships a little bit more, just because of the fact that we can communicate easier on these topics. Next one's labor availability and skills. Again, one of the first things that pushed us towards international outsourcing from the U.S. side was the access to less expensive labor, in Mexico and then in China and in other places. So that labor availability is a driving force for people to conduct international supply chain. And not only does it then put your supply chain become international, but a lot of times those same markets become places for you to sell your finished product as well. And then transnational corporations is just this trend towards really large companies, multinational companies. And all a multinational company is just somebody who owns businesses in more than one nation. So they're a multinational company. But you hear them you'll hear them in the movies, and you'll hear about them talked a lot, and it's becoming a trend where businesses, again, whether it be a joint venture or they just outright buy someone, they want to expand their mode of operation either into a different area or have a different production facility, and they'll just buy a company. And so now that's a trend that is increasing the globalization efforts. So those are a lot of the factors that are going on, and breaking into those a little bit further. The book goes, this is the bottom of 174, but mostly on 175. It's just digging into some of these items a little more closely. Foreign competition in local markets under the whole global market forces, again, top of 175. As capitalists, we believe more competition is better. So when we're going global, we're competing with somebody in their local market, but it's going the other direction as well, where now companies are coming in and competing in our backyard as well. That competition, just improves forces businesses to improve and become more efficient. The growth in foreign demand, again, for a U.S.-based company who maybe has been around a long time, they're thinking, man, we're kind of selling to everywhere we can sell, and not that they give up, but this idea of, hey, wait, we can go to India and sell to 1 billion people. Okay, great. Let's figure out how we got to do that. So those opportunities are huge. So it merits businesses trying to figure that out. Global presence as a defense tool. Well, again, competition is huge, and so some businesses are saying, hey, look, eventually somebody's going to compete with us from this other country. We might as well get ahead of the game and get in that marketplace, in that area of the world, and begin to figure out what's the best way for us to produce our stuff, sell our stuff, whatever the case may be, almost as a proactive approach. Companies forced to develop and enhance leading edge technologies and products. Again, back to that competition piece. Technological forces. Down towards the bottom, close to production and close to expertise. So we might be looking at a new facility because we want to produce the item that we want to produce right in the backyard of the place we want to sell it. So we might be moving our technology to get closer to the consumer. We might also be moving to get closer to a labor pool or a skill of labor that maybe we don't have. And so we want to get closer to these experts that can help us. Global cost factors, a couple we want to cover here. Obviously, we touched on labor and places where we can get low labor costs. So we might be moving just simply because our production process is labor intensive, and we want to keep that cost as low as possible. Could be a capital intensive facility, and so we're looking for tax breaks, price breaks, things that make us be able to build our facility at a lower price point. So we're looking at different countries, different regions for someone to welcome us. Kind of a lot what Amazon is going through right now with their world headquarters, and you heard about kind of the New York, not willing to give them what they thought they were going to get in the way of tax benefits. So, and then the last one, political and economic factors. I touched on Donald Trump being a little bit more of a protectionist, meaning a protectionist wants to artificially protect, support domestic manufacturing or domestic business. And those policies can impact our ability to conduct global business. Because if I make it harder for, say, China to sell their TVs here in the U.S., make it more difficult for them to export those TVs to the U.S. to help support our local TV manufacturers, well, then when I want to now sell, some item in China, cars, whatever, they're gonna turn around and make that more difficult for us to sell the cars there. So it's a very complex give and take, basically, in negotiation in the political arena. And so if you get into international business, you'll cover things like tariffs, which are really just taxes, quotas, and the ways that governments can control those tariffs and quotas to try to artificially increase the price of products that are being imported or exported. Okay, and so those can obviously have ramifications on our global supply chain. Not real worried about you knowing these 10 steps. I mean, read through them, but they're pretty self-explanatory. But I'm not, it's not a test question for you to come up with these 10 steps. So just take a look at those. Like at the top of 176, it says, basically your supply chain, your global supply chain has all the things that your domestic supply chain would have, plus it requires additional information on international logistics, law, customs, culture, ethics, language, politics, government, and currency. Oh, that's it? Okay, great. So again, hopefully you get a sense there, and we're going to talk more about risk here in a little bit, but hopefully you get a sense there of how much more complex your global supply chain is. Let me list those again. So you got to do all the things that you have with your domestic supply chain. You have to have all those as well, but then you're going to also have international law, customs, culture, ethics, language, politics, government, and currency that I need to understand. So that's, again, where sometimes you see a joint venture or a strategic alliance come together because a company that's maybe domestic is saying, hey, look, I want to get into Europe, but man, I don't understand those laws and I don't understand the currency, and I'm just going to actually partner with somebody who's already there to handle my distribution, or handle a piece of my supply chain in Europe. So lots of opportunities there. The primary methods, not shocking if you just think about it, right? I mean, to conduct international commerce, we probably got to put something in a boat or put it up in the air. Obviously, Canada and Mexico can be done through rail, but when you start talking just globally, your primary method of transportation is ocean. And especially with the rise of containers like we talked about. So now these large shipping vessels can house tons and tons of cargo and really efficiently transfer product from one country to another. So they break down the kind of different types of vessels that can be contracted. A liner is somebody that has maybe regular routes. A charter is somebody that is for hire that you can get to perform for you, and then you can all get a private carrier as well. So very similar. Is there a route that already exists I can throw my container on, or do I want an entire ship of my own? Okay, so again, kind of makes sense there. And then air obviously is an option, but again, what we don't like about air is the total cost can be pretty substantial, and obviously the amount of payload that you can put in a plane is obviously a lot less. So the advantages obviously is it's going to be faster, to get to your destination. Once you get inside the country that you're conducting business in, we're back to rail and trucks and motor carriers being the primary methodology inside a country. Air and ocean are really just what's connecting one country to another. Talks about some intermediaries. Again, packaging might be a big one. Your packaging is a little bit more involved when you start shipping internationally. Has to be labeled a little bit more detailed. Might need to be packaged, protected a little bit more, so your packaging becomes a little bit more rigorous in international. You might also have some storage facilities. I mean, you're going to have all kinds of intermediaries. Again, we talked about the freight forwarders who are now maybe helping you with the customs paperwork and the taxation and those sorts of things. So you'll have different intermediaries out there helping you. The risks and challenges. I really want you to focus on this list at the bottom of 179. We've touched on the fact that global supply chains are more complex, and that complexity can be translated into additional risk. And so we need to understand those risks, because we have to decide how we want to mitigate those risks. What do we want to do to counteract those risks? Obviously, our cost is probably going to be a little bit more because we're talking a further distance, and that we want to understand those considerations. So over at the bottom of 179, what are the sources of supply chain risk? And then it's got a bunch listed here. And I want to go through these. Raw material price fluctuation. Again, you have that domestically as well. You know, our raw materials can fluctuate in price, but they might fluctuate even more when we're talking different areas of the world that you're sourcing from. Currency fluctuations. What does that matter? Well, again, you know, slightly beyond the scope of this class, but if I have a weak dollar, okay, that means when I want to go buy something to import it, I got to spend more of my dollars to get that item. If I have a weak dollar, though, when people want to buy something from me, meaning I want to export something, they can buy a lot of my stuff because their yen, let's say, is stronger to my dollar. So those currencies will actually change the cost of these items that you're buying internationally. And so you got to have somebody that's watching that. Market changes. Again, especially in your developing markets, a lot less established. Things are changing more quickly. So I need to know, what's my customer doing? What's my customer base? Is it growing? Is it not growing? Etc. Energy and fuel price volatility. Again, typically in a global supply chain, you're talking a further distance, which means you're going to use more energy. And now swings in that energy cost is going to have a greater impact on your total supply chain cost. Environmental catastrophes. Again, when I'm covering a further geographic region, I'm at more risk of natural environmental occurrences having a negative impact on the performance of my supply chain. I might miss delivery dates. I might have damaged product. I might have lost product. So environmental, raw material scarcity, again, now part of the reason that you're going global is you're hoping to find additional suppliers of this raw material, but those suppliers may be new to you, and they may be new in the industry, and maybe they're having trouble getting the volume that you need. Rising labor costs. I might have gone there originally because of low labor costs, but as I have been there, the standard of living in the community in the area that my factory is now going up, and I actually have other plants moving in and threatening to steal my workers, and so simple supply and demand is causing me to pay more for my labor than I used to have to pay. And then geopolitical instability. Okay, big one here. Again, when you're dealing with other countries, their political stability can be difficult. Sorry, I got a phone ringing here. Sorry about that. I forgot to turn my ringer off. So geopolitical stability can be a real challenge as you're trying to work with different countries to get your product either sold and delivered, or supplies brought in, or manufacturing performed. Think of things like wars. President gets ousted, and now a whole different regime comes in, and they got a different view towards business. So all those things can have a pretty big impact. So make sure you take some time to think through those. Moving on over to 180, it does say, how can we mitigate some of these disruptions? So over here on 180, there's several. Implement dual sourcing strategy. What do they mean by dual sourcing strategy? Okay, again, you're talking, we've mentioned about the risk that maybe a supplier runs out of raw materials, or the supplier doesn't produce the volume that we need. Okay, well, a dual source strategy is saying, let's have two suppliers. If we're worried about that volume being consistent, let's make sure we have a couple suppliers so that we can mitigate that risk. Use both a regional and a global strategy. So again, let's have maybe one of those suppliers, one of those relationships be geographically closer to us than maybe another one. So that now if the international transportation availability is difficult, I've got a regional provider who can still get things to me. Okay. Pursue first and second tier supplier collaboration. So just like your regular supply chain, let's work with those vendors and suppliers and intermediaries to try to smooth out forecasting demands and just work more closely and more efficiently together. Pursue demand collaboration with customers. Again, just what we talked about. Let's try to avoid the bullwhip. Let's really try to focus with our consumers and our customers on what their needs are going to be, and try to work that information back through our supply chain all the way back to our first and second tier suppliers. Okay, that's going to move us over into key global supply chain challenges. Some of these we've covered already. Yeah, we've touched on a lot of these. Let's get into risk management. Just because something is risky, we don't just throw our hands up and be like, oh, shoot, that's going to be hard. Right? So we have a whole process for managing and mitigating risk. And the book at the top of 181, it says the risk beyond just the demand and supply variability. We're talking about limited capacity, quality issues, and then you got other trends like greater customer expectations, global competition, longer, more complex supply chains, increased product variety, shorter life cycles, security and political and currency risks. So this is the global supply chain just has more risk, and we need to be prepared to manage it. So I give you this little graph. I don't necessarily love this little vulnerability graph, but obviously risks with a high disruption probability and severe consequences. Okay, so high disruption, severe consequences. This area in the quadrant is where we want to make sure we definitely have backup plans and risk mitigation efforts being made. They break down sources of risk as internal and external. So internal risks a lot of times are process risks. So a lot of the value-added managerial activities that we take by the firm, and then control risks. So procedures, systems, things that we do internally. External risk, demand and supply risks. So we may have a drop in demand, or we may have a rise in demand. We may have a drop in supply or a rise in supply, and those two may not be in balance, and that becomes a source of risk for us. Might be a flow of product, or it might be a flow of information from the extended supply chain network. You also have on the external side, you have environmental risks. We've touched on these a little bit. Could be a disruption, could be weather, contamination, natural disasters. I mean, there's just all kinds of environmental risks that can disrupt our supply chain. Supply chain disruptions are the actual occurrence of risk. And there are unplanned and unanticipated events that disrupt the normal flow of goods and materials. I'd like to change that slightly. You do anticipate them because we're sitting here talking about these risks that we know could happen. You just don't know when and where they're going to happen. So you have to be prepared for these risks to manifest. And so I disagree a little bit with unanticipated because you just don't know exactly when it's going to happen. The actual characteristics of supply chain structure you have may determine the drivers of your supply chain's vulnerability. So just saying, hey, look, every supply chain's vulnerability is going to be slightly different because they're all built and structured slightly different. But again, it walks us through these things, and we've touched on a lot of these that can exasperate or help your global supply chain. So the bottom of 183 is covering some of these. One of them, that, again, think about if you're in a lean or just-in-time manufacturing environment where the precision delivery times are really critical. Well, that can make your, if that's this type of supply chain you're running, now a global version of that, it becomes a little more risky. Okay, so it's covering a lot of different things here. And then it gets into this risk mitigation, which is what's on the slide up here, and it's over to page 184. Supplier failure. We might be able to use multiple suppliers. If we're having quality issues, look at our supplier selection, training, and certification and monitoring process. Again, are we working really well with our suppliers, or are we just kind of like, hey, make it for us and let us know when you're done? If we're having logistics delays, we can have multiple transportation modes. Again, maybe everything is traveling by ocean, but we have a whole response capability to put things in the air and get things faster if we need to. If you're having political problems, you can buy some insurance. You can partner with somebody who knows the political area better than you. If you're having natural catastrophes, we can also buy insurance for that. And again, look at maybe some alternate sources, different suppliers in a different area, so that the natural catastrophe is less damaging. Theft, vandalism, terrorism. Again, you might benefit from partnering with a carrier that knows the area and knows who needs to be taken care of and those sorts of things to have this go as smoothly as possible. I think that's everything here. Yeah. Okay, so that was chapter 11. Again, wish we could have talked about that in class. I think it would have made for a pretty good debate and discussion. But nonetheless, you've got some of that information. Again, chapters 6 through 11 will be your test. 20 answers, 20 questions, free response. We'll do that first thing Monday, and then we will lecture after that on our next chapter. So chapter 12, we'll take a look at as well. So if you have any questions over the weekend, just shoot me an email. Otherwise, I'll see everybody on Monday. And again, hope the glare wasn't too bad on these slides. I'll look forward to seeing what you guys thought when I see you on Monday. So thanks a lot. Have a good weekend.